Welcome. This is Lecture 2 of Environmental Science 101, and today we're going to talk about patterns and how we can look at patterns in general to try to understand complex processes. The learning objectives for this week are going to be to understand why you need to recognize patterns, in particular those that result from complex interacting processes. And some examples of those we'll talk about are in space and in time. And another important aspect of this week's lecture is going to be to try to identify what underlying mechanism was most likely to have caused this pattern, rather than trying to prove that there's a cause and effect relationship. So patterns of interactions are spatial or temporal tracks that indicate there's some underlying interactions. And a complex interaction is when you have multiple actors interacting with each other all the time, and the result of each interaction depends on every other interaction. So one of my favorite patterns occurs all over the place if you just start looking for it, and it's called an island labyrinth pool. And just to the right, here's an example of it. If you look at the dark patterns, they are sometimes form like a little labyrinth, but then they form off these little islands, and then there's little pools of just dark surrounded by lighter color. So this island labyrinth pool, it's caused by interaction across space and time. And this ILP pattern, I'll call it, is what you can see it in the fringe of a lake. This is the north end of Agency Lake, and where the plants are growing, where there's a few plants right next to them, there'll be more plants, and you get this rough idea of an island labyrinth pool pattern. Now this can come about by a process where there's interaction across space. So here, consider a grid where there's just, the simplest example is that there's a little water flowing from the top of the grid down to the bottom of the grid. And the vegetation that grows on this very slight slope, you can say relative to this spot here, as the water, if there's a high plant activity up where that red spot is, that means that would inhibit relative to where we are. If there's moderate plant activity, it would be less inhibition. And then relative to where you are, if there's plants around this square called relative to here, that will actually promote more plant growth there. The sort of self-shading and the little microclimate that's provided actually promotes that. So upslope there's inhibition, takes water away, but there's stimulation from the nearest and downstream, as it were, cells on this grid. And this process then takes place, and then if you have high plant activity, it'll inhibit the next set of squares, and actually it can move across the landscape, sort of creeps across the landscape with time. So it's a dynamic pattern, and what you're seeing, the island labyrinth pool pattern that you see at any time, is just a snapshot. But it indicates that there could be this underlying set of processes. Here's some other examples. This is shrubs on a hillside in the Gredos Mountains in Spain, and probably down in the lowland that you're looking at right in the front of the picture, it's covered in snow too late, but as you move up the slope, the stress from being in the snow and being in this freezing zone puts a lot of stress on the plants, and it results in these sort of clumpiness of the shrubs, and they demonstrate a very similar pattern to this ILP. On the left is grass in a xeric region in the Niger. Again, it's sort of the typical, or the sort of storybook case of this, where the water is flowing very slowly across this relatively flat, dry area, and the clumps of plants inhibit other clumps further away, but they promote clumps right next to it. And then in the right, you see algae growing in shallow water, and where the clumps of algae come up out of the water, sort of a aquatic vegetation comes up out of the water, forms a very characteristic ILP pattern. Now, what did we learn from recognizing this pattern? Well, first of all, until you start looking for it, I don't think you even have a name for the ILP. So you just don't even recognize it. You don't have a name for it. You don't recognize it. So that's one thing. You're learning, by putting names or identifiers to these complex patterns. It helps you identify them. And then what we see is that there's interacting processes. In the ILP process, there was both local and distant, and with time. And we recognize we're only seeing a snapshot, but by looking at well-studied examples, such as the grasses in the Niger or the shrubs on a hillside, that helps us interpret novel observations of this same pattern. Gets us to start thinking, well, maybe it has a very similar underlying set of complex interactions. Now, we could use this, and for example, in the marsh, we could use this because maybe if we wanted to expand the marsh, we could place little islands that might extend the ILP pattern. Strategically placed little floating islands might extend that. So you could actually help the ILP pattern along by putting in tiny little islands. You don't have to go in and redo the whole process of marsh generation. You might be able to accelerate it by just putting in targeted little areas. Okay, the problem with this is that we're talking about a likely pattern, and there's no proof that there is a cause. So it's very difficult to make a statement that we could place little islands there and then prove that the effect of that was the growth of the marsh. Now, you're going to talk about other patterns in the lab because you're going to be looking at corridors and landscape patterns, and there's temporal patterns. Some are very predictable, daily pattern of the sun coming up and going down, tidal, annual. Then they get to be less predictable, like El Nino or the monsoons. There's big landscape patterns that you can recognize and you can see on any sort of satellite image. Checkerboards from farm use, interdigitated, where farmland naturally meets sort of grassland. Grassland meets forest. Mosaic of small little pieces on the landscape. And then there's small spatial patterns that you're going to study in lab about the plant distribution, whether it's clumped or random or regular. And then there's spatial temporal patterns that we're not going to talk much about in this class, but you might see in other ones like animal migration or the transhumance. So a key concept in this class is that we're looking for likely explanations rather than a proof of a cause-effect relationship. So this is because any set of interactions that are out there, any set of complex interactions, can lead to many different patterns. It's not a strict set of causes leads to one particular pattern. And because of that, there's overlapping results from patterns. So you could see a pattern that might be the result of several underlying mechanisms. So the best you can do is find a mechanism that generates a similar pattern and say it is likely that that same underlying mechanism generated this pattern. So that's what we're looking for. What is likely the mechanism that generates that pattern, not what is proof. So this is a key concept in complexity. We can identify the factors that contribute to a pattern, but we can't really prove that it led to that specific outcome. And there's a couple key examples. One is demographic transition, which the factors include industrialization of countries, which led to higher income, which led to smaller families, which was helped along by education, women's rights, and other factors. And we can't really tease out which factors are dominant in that. We can say all of these factors work together, and there's a synergy between all these factors that work together. Similarly, in food web dynamics, very complex system, we have the species that are there, the weather, the human impacts, and other factors. And what's important about this is that when we're studying it as a complex system, if we try too hard to tease out just a few dominant factors, we might actually interfere with our understanding of the problem. And there's going to be a good example of that in the TED Talk later in the course. During this week and in the rest of the course, I want you to try to extend the number of patterns that you recognized are the result of complex interactions. And by playing with the simulations and looking at the descriptions of how these came about, I want you to try to understand how many interacting parts that are each very simple, each part is very simple, leads to these complex patterns. And then also think about how you can work with, that is along with, that same sort of pattern and process at this small scale. What can you do at a small scale that promotes the pattern or inhibits the pattern and sort of pushes it in the way you want it to go? This is part of the art of working with ecosystems, is to be able to find the little levers and the little pieces that you can do that don't overwhelm the whole system, but contribute to the outcome that you want. Thank you.